My stepmother showed up at my father's funeral demanding half his estate. She claimed I wasn't his biological son and had the paperwork to prove it. What we found in his safe deposit box changed everything. Diane didn't wait until after the burial. She didn't even wait until the service ended. The pastor was still mid-sentence about my father's generosity and kindness when she stood up from the third row, walked straight to the pulpit, and interrupted him. "I need everyone here to know something important before we proceed," she said, her voice cutting through the church like glass. The pastor stopped talking, his mouth hanging open in confusion. 200 people turned in their pews to stare at her. I was sitting in the front row between my wife Claire and my uncle Lawrence, and I felt Claire's hand tighten on mine. Diane pulled a manila envelope from her purse and held it up like evidence at a trial. "Richard's will leaves everything to his son, but I have proof that David isn't actually Richard's biological child. I'm contesting the will, and I'm entitled to half the estate as his widow." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear someone's phone vibrating 3 rows back. My heart was hammering so hard I thought people could hear it. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. "What are you talking about?" My voice came out strangled, nothing like I wanted it to sound. Diane looked directly at me with this expression that was almost pitying, which made it worse somehow. "I found DNA test results in Richard's office. You're not his son. He knew it. And now I'm making sure his estate is divided fairly." I'd been Richard Carver's son for 34 years, or at least I thought I had been. My mother died when I was 6, and it had been just me and Dad after that. He raised me alone, never remarried until 3 years ago when he met Diane at a charity fundraiser. She was 41 to his 63, a pharmaceutical sales rep with a bright smile and an ability to make my father laugh in a way I hadn't heard since Mom died. I'd been cautious about her at first, protective of Dad, but she seemed genuinely caring. She'd cook him healthy meals and make sure he took his blood pressure medication. She'd ask me about my work as an architect and remember details about my projects. When they got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, I gave them my blessing because Dad seemed happy. That was 3 years ago. Dad died 2 weeks ago from a massive heart attack in his sleep. He was 66. The grief had hit me like a physical force, this crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. And now Diane was standing in front of his casket, telling me and everyone we knew that I wasn't actually his son. The funeral home director, a thin man named Morris with kind eyes, gently escorted Diane back to her seat. He apologized to the pastor and suggested we continue the service. The pastor tried to pick up where he left off, but his words sounded hollow now, competing with the whispers that had started spreading through the pews like wildfire. I sat back down and stared at Dad's casket, my mind unable to process what had just happened. Claire leaned over and whispered, "She's lying. She has to be lying." I wanted to believe that. But why would she lie about something so easily disproven? If she was making it up, I could just take my own DNA test and prove her wrong, which meant either she was spectacularly stupid or she actually had something. The service ended and people filed past to offer condolences, but their words felt different now. Sympathetic looks had an edge of curiosity. Hugs felt more awkward. I could feel the questions they weren't asking. Several people who'd known my father for decades looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time, trying to decide if I looked like him or not. Uncle Lawrence, Dad's older brother, pulled me aside near the casket. He was 70 with white hair and my father's same blue eyes. "Don't let her do this to you," he said quietly. "Richard loved you. That's what matters." But his eyes held doubt, and that doubt felt like betrayal. The burial was supposed to be immediate family only, but Diane made it clear she planned to attend. I couldn't stop her. She was Dad's legal widow. We stood around the grave in the cold November air, while the pastor said more words I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. Diane stood on the opposite side of the grave, watching me. When it was over and they began lowering the casket, she walked over to where Claire and I stood. "I know this is difficult," she said, her voice soft and reasonable, which somehow made it more infuriating. "But Richard's estate is worth $2.8 million. The house, his investments, his life insurance. If you're not his biological son, I'm entitled to half as his surviving spouse. I'm not trying to hurt you, David. I'm just protecting what's legally mine." Claire stepped between us. "You just disrupted his funeral. You humiliated him in front of everyone who loved him. How dare you pretend this is about being fair?" Diane's expression hardened slightly. "I have a lawyer. You should get one too. We can settle this in probate court like adults, or we can drag it out and spend Richard's money on legal fees. Your choice." She turned and walked to her car, leaving me standing at my father's grave wondering if my entire life had been a lie. I called my father's estate attorney that afternoon from the funeral home parking lot. His name was Gerald Thompson, a man in his late 50s who'd handled Dad's legal affairs for over 20 years. He knew about Dad's will because he'd drafted it. Everything went to me. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance, the savings. Dad had left Diane out entirely, which at the time I'd thought was strange, but assumed had something to do with protecting assets he'd accumulated before their marriage. Now it took on a different meaning. Gerald's voice was calm when he answered, but I could hear the tension underneath. "David, I heard what happened at the funeral. I'm so sorry. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? We need to discuss this immediately. I agreed and hung up. Claire drove us home because my hands were shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel steady. Our house felt wrong when we walked in, like everything had shifted slightly out of place. Claire made tea that neither of us drank while I sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. What if it's true? I finally said. Claire looked at me with fierce certainty. Then your father chose not to tell you for a reason. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did know and loved you anyway. Either way, you're his son in every way that matters. But legal inheritance didn't care about what mattered in emotional terms. It cared about biology and documentation and proof. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Claire and replayed every memory I had of my father, looking for signs I'd missed. Did I look like him? I'd always thought I had his nose, his jawline, but now that I was questioning it, I wasn't sure. I had brown eyes to his blue. My hair was darker, my build thinner. These were things I'd never thought about before because why would I? He was my dad. That's just how I looked. Around 3 a.m., I got up and pulled out old photo albums from the hall closet. I found pictures of Dad holding me as a baby, pictures from my childhood, pictures from my college graduation. In every single one, he was smiling at me with unmistakable pride and love. Whatever Diane claimed about DNA, these photos showed a father and son. But photographs wouldn't hold up in court against genetic evidence. I needed to know the truth. I went online and ordered a DNA test kit, the kind you could buy directly without a doctor. It would take 2 weeks to get results, but at least I'd have my own proof instead of relying on whatever Diane claimed to have found. Gerald Thompson's law office was in a restored Victorian building downtown with dark wood paneling and leather furniture that smelled like old books. He greeted me in his reception area with a handshake that lingered a moment too long, like he was trying to offer comfort through grip strength. We sat in his office, and he pulled out a thick folder with my father's name on it. Let me start by saying that your father's will is very clear, Gerald began. He left specific instructions that you inherit everything. Diane gets nothing beyond what she's legally entitled to as a surviving spouse, which in this state is minimal since they were only married 3 years, and he had significant premarital assets. He paused and adjusted his glasses. However, if you're proven not to be Richard's biological son, the will's provisions could be challenged. The estate would likely be divided according to intestate succession laws, which would give Diane a much larger share as the surviving spouse. I felt my stomach drop. How much larger? Gerald looked down at his notes. Potentially half, like she said. Maybe more, depending on how the court interprets the situation. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. This is a copy of the document Diane's attorney sent over this morning. It's a DNA paternity test dated 8 months ago, showing a 0% probability that Richard Carver is your biological father. The document looked official. It had a lab name I recognized from genetic testing commercials. It listed my father's name and my name and showed results in scientific terminology I didn't fully understand, but the conclusion was clear in bold print. Probability of paternity? 0%. Richard Carver is excluded as the biological father of David Carver. My hands went numb holding the paper. 8 months ago. Dad had taken this test 8 months before he died. He knew. He knew I wasn't his biological son, and he never told me. Gerald was still talking. The chain of custody on this test is questionable. Diane claims she found it in Richard's home office, but there's no way to verify when or how it was actually conducted. We can challenge the validity and request a new court-ordered test with proper documentation. I looked up at him. I already ordered my own test. I swabbed my cheek this morning and sent it in. Gerald nodded approvingly. Good, that's smart. But even if your test confirms what this one says, it doesn't automatically invalidate the will. We can argue that Richard knew about the paternity situation and chose to leave everything to you anyway. Intent matters in estate law. But we both knew that would be a harder fight. And it would mean admitting in court that I wasn't actually Richard Carver's biological son, which would become public record. Everyone would know. I left Gerald's office and drove to my father's house, the place where I'd grown up. It was a 3-bedroom craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard where Dad had taught me to throw a baseball. Diane had changed the locks after the funeral, which I discovered when my key didn't work. I stood on the front porch of my childhood home, unable to get inside, and felt a rage so intense it made my vision blur. This was my house, my home, the place where my father had raised me, where every room held memories of him teaching me to tie my shoes, helping me with homework, talking to me about girls and college and life. And Diane had locked me out of it. I called Gerald from the driveway. He sighed when I told him about the locks. She has a legal right to the house until the estate is settled. It was their marital home. I'll file a motion for you to access your personal belongings, but it might take a few days. A few days. I couldn't even get my own childhood photos because my father's widow of 3 years had decided I didn't belong there anymore. I drove home and told Claire what happened. She made me eat something even though I wasn't hungry, and then she sat next to me on the couch and said, "We're going to fight this, whatever it takes." The next morning, Diane's attorney called. His name was Philip Granger, and he had the smooth voice of someone who did this for a living. "Mr. Carver," I represent Diane Carver in the matter of your father's estate. I'd like to discuss a settlement that would be beneficial for both parties. I put him on speaker so Claire could hear. What kind of settlement? Philip cleared his throat. Given the paternity test results, my client is willing to offer you $500,000 from the estate in exchange for dropping any claim to the remainder. That's a generous offer considering you have no biological relationship to the deceased. My jaw clenched. He was my father. He raised me. He wanted me to have everything. Philip's voice remained maddeningly calm. What he wanted is irrelevant if the will was based on a false premise. The court will see this as fraud, intentional or not. You claim to be his son. You benefited from that relationship financially and emotionally, and now you're attempting to inherit under false pretenses. My client is being more than fair by offering you anything at all. I hung up on him. Claire looked at me with fire in her eyes. Don't you dare take that offer. I wasn't going to, but I also wasn't sure how to fight someone who seemed to hold all the cards. Gerald filed a formal objection to Diane's contest of the will and requested a hearing in probate court. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which felt like an eternity. In the meantime, I received my DNA test results back from the mail order kit. I opened the email on a Friday evening while Claire was making dinner. My hands shook as I clicked the link and read through the scientific jargon to get to the results. There was no comparison to my father's DNA because obviously I didn't have a sample from him, but the test showed my genetic ancestry, my health markers, and my chromosomal makeup. I stared at the ancestry results. 52% Irish, 31% Italian, 12% Eastern European, 5% Scandinavian. My father was almost entirely Irish and Scottish according to family history. That 31% Italian stood out like a neon sign. I'd never known my mother well since she died when I was so young, but Dad had told me she was Irish like him, except apparently that was a lie. Or I wasn't hers either, or something else entirely. The genetic possibilities swirled in my head until I felt dizzy. Claire came into the room and saw my face. What is it? I showed her the results. She read them twice, then looked at me. This doesn't prove anything about your father. You need his DNA to compare. She was right. But how was I supposed to get my father's DNA when he was already buried? I called Gerald and explained the situation. He was quiet for a long moment. Exhumation is possible, but it requires court approval and is extremely expensive. We're talking $5,000 to $10,000 easily, plus legal fees to petition for it. And the court might not grant it since Diane has already provided a paternity test. I felt trapped. That test could be faked. We have no idea if Dad actually took it or if she manufactured it somehow. Gerald sighed. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence that she would do something like that? I didn't. I had suspicion and desperation, but no actual evidence. What about Dad's personal effects? Hair from a hairbrush, a toothbrush, anything with his DNA on it? Gerald's voice perked up slightly. That's a possibility, but you'd need access to the house, which Diane currently controls. He paused. However, I filed that motion for you to retrieve personal property. The judge granted it this morning. You have the right to enter the house with a sheriff's deputy present to collect your belongings and any items that belonged to you before your father's death. Finally, something going right. We scheduled it for the following Monday morning. The sheriff's deputy who met me at Dad's house was a woman in her 40s named Deputy Collins. She had short gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. Diane was already there, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, and her lawyer, Philip Granger, beside her. You have 2 hours to collect your documented personal property, Philip said, holding up a list. We've inventoried the house. If you attempt to take anything not on this list, we'll file theft charges. Deputy Collins stepped forward. Let's keep this civil. Mr. Carver has a right to his belongings. Let him inside. We walked through the front door, and I felt like I was stepping into a museum version of my childhood. Everything looked the same, but wrong somehow, like a stage set. I started in my old bedroom, which Dad had kept mostly intact, even after I moved out 15 years ago. My high school trophies were still on the shelf. My old desk still had books on it. I packed these things into boxes while Diane watched from the doorway. I'm sorry it came to this, she said quietly. I didn't look at her. Are you? Because you don't seem sorry. You seem pretty determined to take everything my father wanted me to have. She was silent for a moment. He wasn't your father. Not biologically. That matters. I turned to face her. It matters to you. It didn't matter to him. She looked away first. While packing my belongings, I kept my eyes open for anything that might have Dad's DNA on it. His bedroom was off limits according to the list, but the bathroom we'd shared when I was young was fair game for my old toiletries. I went in there and saw Dad's toothbrush still in the holder. It was blue with frayed bristles, the same one he'd been using for months. I palmed it while pretending to get something from under the sink and slipped it into my jacket pocket. My heart was racing like I'd committed a crime, but I needed it. I needed proof one way or another. I also grabbed his old razor from the medicine cabinet, hoping there might be skin cells or hair on it. Deputy Collins didn't notice. Neither did Diane or Philip. I finished packing and loaded the boxes into my car, Before I left, I walked through the house one more time, looking at the place where my father had taught me what it meant to be a good man. The living room where we'd watched football games together, the kitchen where he'd made me breakfast every morning before school, the backyard where we'd built a treehouse when I was 10. These were my memories, mine and his. DNA couldn't erase them, but apparently, it could erase my inheritance. I took the toothbrush and razor to a private DNA testing lab that afternoon. The technician was a young guy named Austin who looked barely out of college. I explained that I needed DNA extracted and tested for paternity. He looked at the items and nodded. "We can do that. It'll take about a week for results, and it costs $850. I paid it without hesitation. Austin filled out paperwork and asked me questions about the case. When I explained that my stepmother was contesting my father's will based on paternity, his expression shifted to something like sympathy. "That's rough, man. I'm sorry you're going through that." He promised to rush the results as much as possible. I left the lab feeling like I'd done something productive, but also knowing that the results might destroy me. What if Diane was right? What if Dad really wasn't my biological father? Then who was? And why had no one ever told me? The questions ate at me for the entire week while I waited for Austin to call. I couldn't focus on work. I'd taken bereavement leave from my architecture firm, but even if I'd been there, I wouldn't have been able to concentrate. Claire tried to distract me with movies and dinners out, but everything felt muted and far away. Austin called on a Friday afternoon. "Mr. Carver, I have your results. Do you want me to email them, or would you prefer to come in?" I drove to the lab immediately. Austin met me in a small consultation room with printouts and charts. He sat down across from me and slid the papers over. "I tested the DNA from both items you provided against your DNA sample. The results are conclusive." I held my breath. "The probability of paternity is 0%. The man whose DNA was on these items is not your biological father." The room tilted. I'd known this was a possibility. I'd prepared myself for it, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that hollowed me out. Austin continued gently. "However, the DNA does show a familial relationship. Based on the genetic markers, you share approximately 25% of your DNA with this individual, which indicates a second-degree relative. Most likely, he was your biological uncle." Uncle. The word hung in the air. If Dad was my uncle, that meant his brother was my father. Or his sister, though Dad only had one sibling. Uncle Lawrence. My mind went blank with shock. I sat in my car outside the DNA lab for over an hour trying to process what I'd learned. If Uncle Lawrence was my biological father, that meant he'd had a relationship with my mother. And no one had told me. They'd let me grow up thinking Richard was my dad, when actually my real father was the man I called Uncle Lawrence. The betrayal felt layered and complex. Dad, Richard, had raised me knowing I wasn't his biological son, but never said a word. Lawrence had been in my life my entire childhood, coming to birthdays and holidays and school events, knowing he was my father and pretending to be my uncle. My mother had died with this secret. Why? What possible reason could they have had for hiding this from me? I drove to Lawrence's house without calling first. He lived 45 minutes away in a retirement community for active seniors. His townhouse was neat and well-maintained with a small garden out front. I knocked on his door and he answered, looking surprised to see me. "David, I wasn't expecting you. Come in, come in." He ushered me inside and offered me coffee that I refused. We sat in his living room and I just said it. "I took a DNA test. I know you're my biological father." The color drained from Lawrence's face. He sat down heavily in his chair and put his hands over his face. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "How did you find out?" Lawrence told me everything. He and my mother, Christine, had been in love before she met Richard. They'd dated for 2 years and were talking about marriage when Lawrence got a job offer across the country. He took it, thinking the relationship would survive the distance. It didn't. Christine broke up with him and started dating his brother. "I was devastated," Lawrence said, his voice breaking. "I came home for Christmas that year and saw them together. It killed me." But then Christine called him 6 months later. She was pregnant. She told him the baby was his, from one last night they'd spent together before he moved. She begged him not to tell Richard, because she loved Richard now and wanted to build a life with him. "I made the worst decision of my life," Lawrence said. "I agreed to keep quiet. I convinced myself it was better for everyone. Richard wanted to be a father so badly, and Christine loved him. I thought I was doing the right thing by stepping aside." Richard knew. Christine told him the truth before they got married. Richard decided to raise me as his own son, legally adopting me without ever telling me I was adopted. They agreed that Lawrence could be part of my life as my uncle, but the truth would stay hidden. "We thought we were protecting you," Lawrence said. "We thought it would be easier for you to have one father instead of two, to grow up normal without all this complicated history." I felt like I was made of glass, and someone had just struck me with a hammer. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. "You let me grow up calling you uncle," I said, my voice shaking. "You were at my baseball games, my graduation, my wedding. You were there for everything, and you never told me you were my father." Lawrence was crying openly now. I wanted to tell you so many times, especially after Christine died. But Richard and I agreed that it would just hurt you to know. We thought keeping the secret was protecting you. I stood up. You were wrong. You were all wrong. I walked out of his house and sat in my car, shaking with rage and grief and confusion. My father, Richard, had loved me enough to raise me as his own, even knowing I was his brother's son. He'd never treated me differently, never made me feel less than fully his, and he'd died without ever telling me the truth. Lawrence had given me life, but let someone else be my father. Both of them had lied to me every single day of my life, and my mother had started it all by asking them to. I didn't know who to be angry at or how to grieve for people who'd loved me but betrayed me in such a fundamental way. I drove home and told Claire everything. She listened without interrupting, holding my hand while I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do about Diane?" she finally asked. I'd almost forgotten about Diane in the chaos of discovering my true paternity. But this changed everything. If Richard wasn't my biological father, then legally his estate wouldn't go to me under the will. It would be divided among his surviving relatives, which included Diane and Lawrence. Diane would get half or more. I'd get nothing, unless I could prove that Richard had known the truth and wanted me to inherit anyway. "I need to find proof that Dad knew," I said. "Something that shows he deliberately chose to leave everything to me, despite knowing I wasn't biologically his." Claire squeezed my hand. "Where would he keep something like that?" I thought about it. Dad had been meticulous about important documents. He had a file cabinet in his office at home, but Diane controlled that now. He also had a safe deposit box at the bank that I'd never been inside. "The safe deposit box," I said. "Whatever he didn't want anyone to find, he'd keep there." Gerald agreed that accessing the safe deposit box was our best option. As the executor of the will, I had the legal right to open it and inventory the contents. We made an appointment at First National Bank for the following Monday morning. The bank manager was a woman in her 50s named Victoria Cross, who'd known my father for years. She expressed her condolences and led me to the vault area where the safe deposit boxes were kept. She used her key, and I used the key from Dad's personal effects, which Gerald had obtained during the estate inventory. The box slid out, and Victoria left me alone in a private viewing room. Inside the safe deposit box were documents I expected: the deed to the house, stock certificates, savings bonds, his discharge papers from the military. But at the bottom was a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Dad's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated 6 months before he died, along with several other documents. I read the letter first. "David, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've probably discovered the truth about your paternity. I'm sorry I never told you in person. I was a coward. I kept thinking I'd find the right time, the right words, but I never did. I want you to know that from the moment Christine told me you were Lawrence's biological son, I never once thought of you as anything less than mine. I chose to be your father. I chose to raise you and love you and guide you through life. Biology didn't matter to me. You were my son in every way that counted. I'm leaving you everything in my will because you're my son. Not Lawrence's, not in the ways that matter. Mine. I've enclosed the original paternity test I took 8 months ago when Diane started asking questions about why you weren't mentioned in my previous will. I wanted proof that I knew the truth, so no one could claim I was deceived. I also enclosed legal adoption papers that I finalized 30 years ago, making you legally my son regardless of biology. I don't know what Diane will do after I'm gone, but I suspect she'll cause trouble. She's been different these past few months, colder, more calculating. I started to wonder if she married me for my money. Don't let her take what's yours. You earned it by being my son, by making my life full of joy and purpose. Fight for what I'm leaving you. You're Richard Carver's son, always. Love, Dad. I sat in that bank vault room and cried, big heaving sobs that shook my whole body. My father had known the truth and loved me anyway. He'd chosen me. The adoption papers made it legal and binding. I was Richard Carver's son by law, regardless of DNA. The paternity test he'd included was the same one Diane had found in his office. But this version had a note paperclipped to it in Dad's handwriting. Took this test voluntarily on January 15th to establish documented knowledge of David's paternity, to be used in estate planning. He'd created a paper trail proving he knew I wasn't his biological son when he wrote his will. That meant the will couldn't be contested on grounds of fraud or mistake. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he left me everything. I gathered all the documents carefully and put them in my briefcase. Victoria came back in and asked if I'd found what I needed. I told her I had. I called Gerald from the parking lot and told him about the letter and the adoption papers. His reaction was immediate and triumphant. "This changes everything. The adoption makes you his legal heir regardless of biology. Diane's contest has no grounds. We need to file this with the court immediately." The probate hearing was scheduled for the following week. Diane and her lawyer, Philip Granger, sat on one side of the courtroom. Gerald and I sat on the other. The judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Kovacs, who'd been on the bench for over 20 years, according to the nameplate on her desk. Philip presented Diane's case first, arguing that the will was based on false pretenses since I wasn't Richard's biological son. He submitted the paternity test as evidence and called Diane to testify. She took the stand looking polished and sympathetic. "Richard never told me David wasn't his biological son," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I only discovered the truth after he died when I found the DNA test results in his office. I believe Richard was deceived about David's paternity and would have changed his will if he'd known the truth. As his widow, I'm simply asking for what's legally mine." Philip questioned her about the estate's value and her relationship with Richard. She painted herself as a devoted wife who'd been blindsided by this revelation. Then it was Gerald's turn. He stood up with his briefcase and pulled out the documents from the safe deposit box. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit several items into evidence that completely undermine Mrs. Carver's claims." He handed copies to the judge and to Philip. "First, we have legal adoption papers dated 30 years ago, filed in this very courthouse, establishing David Carver as Richard Carver's legal son through adoption. This adoption was never revoked or challenged." The judge examined the papers carefully. Philip looked shocked. Gerald continued. "Second, we have a letter written by Richard Carver 6 months before his death, acknowledging David's biological paternity and explicitly stating his intent for David to inherit his entire estate despite this knowledge." He handed the letter to the judge. "Third, we have Richard Carver's own copy of the paternity test in question, with a handwritten note establishing that he took this test voluntarily to document his knowledge of David's paternity for estate planning purposes. This directly contradicts Mrs. Carver's claim that her husband was deceived." The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of papers as Judge Kovach read through everything. Her expression remained neutral, but I saw her eyebrows raise slightly when she read Dad's letter. Philip was whispering urgently to Diane. She looked pale and angry. Judge Kovach set the papers down and looked at Diane. "Mrs. Carver, did you know about the adoption papers when you filed your contest?" Diane hesitated. "No, Your Honor. I wasn't aware of any adoption." The judge's expression hardened. "These papers are public record, filed in this courthouse. Your attorney could have easily discovered them with basic due diligence. Did you know about your husband's letter?" Diane's voice was quieter now. "No, Your Honor." Judge Kovach looked at the paternity test results. "This is the same test you submitted as evidence, but with your husband's notations removed. Did you remove these notations before submitting it to the court?" Philip stood up quickly. "Your Honor, my client found the test among her husband's papers. She had no knowledge of any additional notations." The judge fixed him with a stare. "Then how do you explain that Mr. Carver's original copy, found in a sealed safe deposit box, has these handwritten notes while your client's copy does not?" Philip had no answer. The judge continued. "It appears to me that someone deliberately altered evidence to present a false narrative to this court. That's fraud, Mr. Granger. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation." The courtroom erupted. Diane stood up, her face red. "This isn't fair. That money should be mine. I was his wife." Judge Kovach banged her gavel. "Sit down, Mrs. Carver. You were married to Mr. Carver for 3 years. David Carver was his legal son for over 30 years. The adoption papers are clear and binding. The will is valid. Your contest is denied." She signed an order and handed it to the clerk. "The estate will be distributed according to Richard Carver's last will and testament, with David Carver as the sole beneficiary. Mrs. Carver, you are entitled to nothing beyond your statutory spousal rights, which I calculate to be approximately $50,000, given the length of your marriage and your independent income." Diane's lawyer tried to object, but the judge cut him off. "The adoption papers alone would have ended this case. The fact that you presented altered evidence suggests this was never about justice. It was about money. This hearing is concluded." She stood up and left the bench. I sat there in stunned silence while Gerald gathered our papers with a satisfied smile. Diane was crying, but they weren't sad tears. They were angry, frustrated tears. She turned to glare at me before Philip pulled her out of the courtroom. Gerald shook my hand. "Congratulations. The house is yours. The money is yours. Everything your father wanted you to have." But I couldn't feel happy about it. Not yet. I walked out of the courthouse and sat on the steps, trying to process everything that had happened. Claire sat down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders. "How are you feeling?" I didn't know how to answer that. My father had left me everything, but he'd also left me with the knowledge that my entire childhood had been built on secrets. Lawrence was my biological father, but Richard had been my dad. Both of them had loved me, but both had lied to me. And Diane, the woman I'd thought genuinely cared about my father, had tried to steal my inheritance by altering evidence and lying to a court. "I feel like I don't know who I am anymore," I finally said. Claire squeezed my shoulder. "You're the same person you were before all this. You're the man your father raised you to be. That's who you are." Maybe she was right. Maybe it didn't matter whose DNA I carried. Dad had chosen me. He'd loved me and raised me and made me his legal son through adoption. That was real, even if the biology wasn't. The district attorney's office contacted me 2 weeks later. An investigator named Dennis Huang wanted to interview me about Diane's altered evidence. I met him at a coffee shop downtown and told him everything I knew. Dennis was in his early 40s with sharp eyes and a methodical way of taking notes. "We're building a case for fraud and attempted theft by deception," he said. The altered DNA test results are clear evidence of intent to defraud the court. If convicted, she could face up to 5 years in prison. Part of me felt sorry for Diane. But then I remembered her standing at my father's funeral, announcing to everyone that I wasn't his son. I remembered her changing the locks on my childhood home. I remembered her offering me $500,000 to go away quietly while she took everything else. Whatever consequences she faced, she'd earned them. Dennis also wanted to talk to Lawrence. I gave him Lawrence's contact information and explained the biological relationship. Dennis raised his eyebrows. That's quite a family situation. I laughed without humor. That's one way to put it. The investigation took 3 months. During that time, I settled into the house that was now legally mine. Claire and I moved into Dad's place, and it felt both right and strange. I kept most of his furniture and personal items, not ready to let go yet. I also started seeing a therapist named Dr. Miriam Lang, who specialized in family trauma and identity issues. She helped me process the anger and confusion I felt about discovering my true paternity. Your father figures, both Richard and Lawrence, made decisions they thought were best for you, Dr. Lang said during one session. They were wrong to keep the truth from you, but their intentions came from love, not malice. That doesn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it provides context. I asked her how I was supposed to forgive people who were dead or who'd lied to me my entire life. She said forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about me letting go of anger that would poison me if I held on to it. That made sense intellectually, but emotionally, I still felt raw. Lawrence called me several times, but I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. Maybe I never would be. He'd had 34 years to tell me the truth and chose not to. That was hard to forgive, regardless of his reasons. The fraud charges against Diane were filed 4 months after the probate hearing. She pleaded not guilty, and the case went to trial. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with Claire beside me. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the original paternity test from Dad's safe deposit box with his handwritten notes, then presented the copy Diane had submitted to probate court with those notes removed. They called the bank manager Victoria Cross to testify that only Diane and I had access to Dad's safe deposit box after his death, and I hadn't opened it until after Diane filed her contest. They called a handwriting expert who testified that the notes on the original test were definitely written by Richard Carver. They called a document examiner who testified that Diane's copy appeared to have been digitally altered to remove the handwritten portions. Diane's defense was that she'd found the test among Richard's papers and didn't know about any handwritten notes. She claimed she'd never seen the original and had simply submitted what she found. But the prosecution produced evidence that Diane had accessed the safe deposit box 3 days after Richard's death, before the funeral. The bank's security footage showed her entering the vault with a bank employee. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: fraud, attempted theft by deception, and perjury for lying to the probate court. Diane showed no emotion when the verdict was read. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison, with credit for time served. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $75,000 to cover my legal fees. I watched them lead her away in handcuffs and felt nothing but emptiness. This wasn't the victory I'd wanted. I'd wanted my father back. I'd wanted the truth about my family without all the pain that came with it. I'd wanted to not have to fight for what should have been mine without question. But none of those things were possible. All I had was justice, and justice felt cold and unsatisfying. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked me how I felt about the verdict. I told them I was glad the truth had come out. They asked about my relationship with Lawrence and whether I'd forgiven him. I said that was private. Claire pulled me away before they could ask more questions. 6 months after the trial, I finally agreed to meet Lawrence for coffee. We sat across from each other at a small cafe, both of us nervous. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said immediately. "I just want you to know how sorry I am. I should have told you the truth years ago." I stirred my coffee and tried to find the right words. "You were my uncle my entire life. You came to my birthday parties and taught me to fish and gave me advice about college. You did all those things knowing you were actually my father, and you never said a word." Lawrence's voice was thick with emotion. "I was a coward. I convinced myself that Richard was your real father because he raised you, and that was true. But it didn't give me the right to hide who I was to you." We talked for over an hour. He told me about loving my mother and losing her. He told me about watching me grow up and feeling proud and heartbroken at the same time. He told me about his regrets, which were many. I listened and tried to understand, even though part of me was still angry. By the end of the conversation, I didn't forgive him. But I didn't hate him either. I told him we could try to build some kind of relationship moving forward, but it would take time. He agreed gratefully. A year after my father's funeral, Claire and I hosted a small gathering at the house to remember Richard. Uncle Lawrence came, along with some of Dad's old friends and co-workers. We shared stories about him and looked at old photos. I gave a short speech about what my father had meant to me, how he'd chosen to be my dad even when biology said otherwise, how that choice was worth more than any genetic connection, how I was grateful every day that he'd decided I was worth raising and loving. After everyone left, I went into Dad's study and sat in his old leather chair. The room still smelled faintly like his cologne. I pulled out the letter he'd left me in the safe deposit box and read it again for probably the 100th time. You were my son in every way that counted. Those words meant everything. They were the proof that love was stronger than DNA, that choice mattered more than chance, that family was what you made it. Diane had tried to take that away from me by reducing our relationship to biology, but she'd failed because the legal system recognized what I'd always known in my heart. Richard Carver was my father, and nothing could change that. Not genetics, not greed, not lies. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my desk drawer. Then I went upstairs to where Claire was reading in bed. She looked up and smiled when I came in. You okay? I nodded. Yeah, I think I finally am. The house became truly mine over the following year. I repainted the walls and updated the kitchen. I kept Dad's workshop in the garage exactly as he'd left it, with his tools hanging on pegboards and his projects half finished on the workbench. Sometimes I went out there and just stood among his things, remembering him teaching me to use a saw or fix a broken chair. Those memories were real, regardless of biology. I also established a scholarship fund in Richard's name at the local community college, giving $50,000 a year to students studying architecture or engineering. Dad had always valued education and would have loved knowing his money was helping young people build better futures. Lawrence and I had coffee about once a month. Our relationship was still complicated, and probably always would be. He wasn't my dad. That role would forever belong to Richard. But he was my biological father, and we were trying to figure out what that meant. He told me stories about my mother that I'd never heard before, which I appreciated. She became more real to me through his memories, less of a shadowy figure I couldn't remember, and more of a complex person who'd made difficult choices. 2 years after everything started, I got a letter from Diane. She was still in prison and would be for another year. The letter was short and didn't say much. She apologized for what she'd done and said she understood why I couldn't forgive her. She said she'd been desperate and scared of being left with nothing after Richard died, and she'd made terrible choices driven by that fear. She didn't ask for anything or try to justify her actions beyond that explanation. I read the letter once and then threw it away. Maybe someday I'd be able to forgive her, but not yet. Not when I could still remember the look on her face at the funeral when she'd announced to everyone that I wasn't Richard's son. Not when I remembered fighting for months to prove what should have been obvious, that my father had wanted me to have everything because I was his son in every way that mattered. The legal battles were over. The questions about my paternity were answered. The inheritance was mine. But the emotional scars remained, and I suspected they always would. Finding out that your entire life was built on secrets changed something fundamental about how you saw the world. It made you question everything, even the things you thought were certain. But it also taught me something valuable. Love was a choice. Richard had chosen to love me and raise me, even though I wasn't biologically his. That choice meant more than DNA ever could. He could have walked away when my mother told him the truth about my paternity. He could have resented me or treated me differently. But he didn't. He chose me every single day of my life, and that was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. I stood in the backyard one evening, looking at the old treehouse Dad and I had built together when I was 10. It was weathered and faded now, but still standing. Claire came out and stood beside me. What are you thinking about? I put my arm around her. I'm thinking about how lucky I was to have Richard Carver as my father. Biology didn't make him my dad. Love did. And that's something Diane could never take away from me, no matter how hard she tried. Claire leaned against me. He'd be proud of you, you know. How you fought for what he left you. How you're building a life here in his house. I thought about that. Dad had always taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right. I'd done that. I'd honored him by refusing to let Diane steal what he'd wanted me to have. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all he would have asked of me. The safe deposit box discovery had changed everything, just like the title promised. It had given me the proof I needed that Dad knew the truth and loved me anyway. It had exposed Diane's fraud and secured my inheritance. But more than that, it had given me closure. Dad's letter had answered the questions I'd been too afraid to ask. Did he know? Did he care? Did he still consider me his son? Yes, and absolutely yes. Those answers let me move forward without the constant doubt that had plagued me after Diane's initial accusation. I wasn't Richard Carver's biological son. I was his chosen son, his legal son, his real son in every way that mattered. And that was enough. That was everything. I turned away from the treehouse and walked back toward the house with Claire. Inside, I could see the warm lights of home, the place where my father had raised me and loved me and taught me what it meant to be a good man. That was my inheritance. Not the money or the house or the investments, though those were significant. My real inheritance was the knowledge that I had been chosen and loved unconditionally by someone who didn't have to choose me but did anyway. That was worth more than any estate could ever be. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.